Dan Belnap is an associate professor of ancient scripture. He received a BA in international relations from BYU, an MA in ancient Near Eastern studies from BYU, an MA and a PhD in Northwest Semantics from the University of Chicago. He is married to Erin Pinney, and they have 4 children, Emma, Jack, Samuel, and Tabitha.
Thank you very much. During the last week of his ministry, Christ was asked what was the great commandment. And in his answer, he suggested 2. The last one being, love thy neighbor as thyself. Though not stated by Christ, this commandment, found in Leviticus 19, is then followed by a similar commandment to love thy stranger as thyself. These 2 principles reflected one of the great principles of the law, the care for the marginalized outsider. Yet the plight of the marginalized was not only realized in the law, it was also found in the writings of the prophets. One such place is Isaiah 56, which gives voice to these marginalized groups as well as revealing the beautiful promises God proclaimed for all of his children. The first of these voices was that of the stranger. Israel's relationship to the stranger was a tricky one. Instruction concerning that relationship appears throughout all 3 of the biblical law codes, outlining the responsibilities, privileges, and restrictions that governed both groups. Complicating the issue is the fact that the designation of stranger is given to 4 different Hebrew words. Get those up there for you. The ger, the zar, the nochri, or the ben-nakar. The terms are not interchangeable, but reflect different aspects or situations in which the stranger may find themselves in relation to Israel. By far, the most common is the stranger as ger, who appears to live among the Israelites in their communities and neighborhoods. Though neighbors, the distinction between the Israelite and the ger was apparently a clear one. In fact, the chief instruction given to Israel regarding the ger was to, quote, not vex or oppress the stranger, suggesting that the stranger was a marginalized minority that could easily be taken advantage of, like other marginalized social cohorts, such as the poor, the widowed, and the fatherless. Legally, this meant that the stranger was to be accorded the same legal rights as Israel. For instance, Deuteronomy 1:16-17, which is instruction given to judges, emphasized that the judge was to, quote, judge righteously between every man and his brother, and the stranger that is with him. Ye shall not respect persons in judgment, but ye shall hear the small as well as the great, unquote. Later, in Deuteronomy 24, verse 17, Israel was commanded to, quote, not pervert the judgment of the stranger, nor the fatherless. Similarly, in Leviticus 24:22, following a passage concerning the principle of just compensation for willful wrongdoing, the Lord declared, you shall have one manner of law, as well for the stranger as for one of your own country. The same language is used in those texts regarding cultic practice or temple worship. In Numbers 15, the stranger sojourning among the greater Israelite community may offer an offering made by fire. As you do, he shall do. This is then followed by the following instruction. One ordinance shall be both for you and of the congregation, and also for the stranger that sojourneth with you. One law and one manner shall be for you and for the stranger. This is repeated a few verses later regarding sin offerings for ignorant acts, while those who perform premeditated acts, either a natural Israelite or a stranger, receive the same penalty. It even appears that the stranger was allowed to participate in important communal rites. Numbers 19 describes the process by which Israel obtained the waters of separation, an item necessary to the purifying of those who had touched or handled the dead. The process included the slaughter of a red heifer and the burning of the carcass outside of the tabernacle. Following its consumption by fire, the ashes were gathered and stored in order to be mixed with water. This mixture was the water of separation, which was then sprinkled on the one handling the dead or on anything that came into contact with the dead. This was an important ordinance, for, quote, whosoever toucheth the dead body of any man that is dead, and purifieth not himself, defileth the tabernacle of the Lord, and that soul shall be cut off from Israel, because the waters of separation was not sprinkled upon him, unquote. While a priest was required for the performance of the slaughter, at least 2 other individuals are mentioned. The first one was he that burneth, or the one who actually placed the carcass on the fire, and the second, the one who gathers up the ashes. All three individuals were to be unclean for the remainder of the day following the performance of the slaughter. That a stranger could be one of the other two appears to be the case as noted in verse 10. And he that gathereth the ashes of the heifer shall wash his clothes and be unclean even until the even. And it shall be unto the children of Israel and unto the stranger that sojourneth among them for a statute forever. Thus, not only was a stranger to be held to the same standard of purification, it was also possible that they could participate directly in at least one of the ordinances that benefited the entire community. This last example suggests that Israel's relationship with a stranger was expected to be more than simply tolerance. In fact, Israel was not to oppress the stranger because, quote, ye were strangers in the land of Egypt, unquote. These allusions to Israel's own history of marginalization meant their own experience was to guide their interaction with the stranger, for ye know the heart of the stranger. This empathy was expected to engender love, as the Israelite was told to love the stranger even as yourself. Such empathy could be expressed during those times of the year that coincided with the feasts and festivals ancient Israel kept. Deuteronomy 16 describes the manner in which Israel was to celebrate the Feast of the Weeks and the Feast of the Tabernacles, respectively. And thou shalt rejoice before the Lord your God, thou and thy son and thy daughter and thy manservant and thy maidservant and the Levite that is within your gates, and the stranger and the fatherless and the widow. As the verse suggests, these festivals were meant to be joyous occasions in which the entire household rested from daily work and remembered the inclusive relationship between themselves and God, often highlighting those events when God himself interacted on their behalf. The feasts also coincided with the agricultural calendar, meaning they often represented periods of plenty and harvest. The instruction to include the marginalized in the celebrations meant more than merely taking care of their physical needs, but their social needs as well. Thus, hospitality was to be a trademark of the Israelites' relationship with the stranger. This empathy could also be reflected in Israel's concern over the stranger's general welfare. As noted earlier, the stranger was often grouped with other marginalized socialities who appeared who do not have their own land of their own, upon which they could acquire sustenance. In light of this plight, Israel was commanded in a number of instances to make sure that when they reaped their harvest, that they left sections of it unharvested, and that they not glean a field again once the harvest was completed. Instead, what remained behind was, thou shalt leave them for the poor and the stranger. Deuteronomy 24, 19 through 22 is even more encompassing, as it incorporates the harvest of olives and grapes as well, stating that the produce left after the initial harvest was for, again, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. The Israelite remembering as they did so, that thou wast a bondman in the land of Egypt. In similar fashion, the third year tithe was specifically designated for the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. You should be seeing a theme by now, that they may eat within the gates and be satisfied. Other instruction in Deuteronomy 24 continues the concern over the economic well-being of the stranger, as Israel is commanded to not oppress the hired hand, whether they are Israelite or stranger, by making sure that they are paid their rightful day wages. Yet for all the inclusionary instruction, the stranger was still understood to be an outsider. While Israel was expected to relate to the stranger, the manner of that relationship was one-sided. Israel was to support the stranger, not the other way around. And in so doing, the differences between the two are emphasized. In other words, while the instruction noted Israel's responsibilities to include the stranger, it did so by highlighting their otherness, the otherness of the stranger. Israel's positive relationship to the stranger was because the stranger was outside, a status that an Israelite could relate to because of their own past, but was no longer their experience. Moreover, there were certain situations in which the stranger, ger, was not on equal par with an Israelite. In Deuteronomy 14, Israel is told they are not to eat any animal that had not been slaughtered first. Thus, an animal that died on its own was not to be consumed by an Israelite, but it could be given to a stranger. Though a seemingly innocuous regulation, it nevertheless highlights that a stranger was not held to the same standard as Israel was. No matter how much they may have been alike, the two were in fact different. Another situation in instruction is that concerning that of the Passover, the defining feast of Israel. Set up in Exodus 12, while the stranger, Ger, was expected to follow the injunction concerning the eating of unleavened bread, they were not required to sacrifice the Paschal lamb. In fact, in verse 43, the general instruction concerning the stranger and the Passover is, quote, "There shall no stranger eat thereof." The term for stranger here is ben nakar, which will be discussed in greater detail later. Here it is enough to note that this is the general instruction. It is followed by the circumstances in which the stranger as Ger could participate in the Passover. But that appears to be the exception to the rule, especially since the exclusion of the stranger from the Passover appears again in Deuteronomy 16. Thus, while the stranger is explicitly invited to participate in the celebrations of the Feast of the Weeks and the Feast of the Tabernacles, the instruction concerning the third primary festival, the Passover, nothing said about including the stranger. In the one feast that was performed explicitly at home, the stranger is not present. Even more difficult to reconcile was the implicit threat the stranger represented. In Deuteronomy 28, though the stranger may have been among Israel from Nebo, the Lord warns that if Israel does not, quote, hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes, then the stranger that is within thee shall get up above thee very high, and thou shalt come down very low. He shall lend to thee, and thou shalt not lend to him. He shall be thy head, and thou shalt be the tail. Thus, even as one is to include the stranger into one's household, the threat that this same individual could potentially rise up and seize your property would be present. The other terms used to describe the stranger demonstrate further the ambivalence Israel had towards the stranger. Unlike the ger, which is the primary term used for the stranger who lives among Israel, the designation zar seems to refer to the stranger or outsider who is distant from Israel's worship and perhaps lifestyle. In light of this, the zar may have had their own worship and social practices, and thus, in a stranger's household, it was entirely possible to have some members who were ger and some who were zar, both interacting directly with Israel. It is even possible that in some instances, the zar stranger was Israelite. For instance, in Leviticus 22, a stranger, zar, is not to eat any food designated for priestly use. In fact, according to Numbers 18, the priest was not to interact with the zar at all. And a stranger shall not come nigh unto you. If they did, then the stranger that cometh nigh shall be put to death. Similarly, in Numbers 1, the stranger that comes near the tabernacle shall be put to death. In these cases, it is unclear whether the designation of stranger refers to a non-Israelite or an Israelite who is deliberately in the wrong place, doing things they should not be doing, reflecting the definition of zar in either case as presented above. If it is the latter, then it is a matter of an Israelite doing stranger things, i.e., acting like a stranger, or as an outsider would, as the term is clearly used to refer to non-Israelites elsewhere. Thus, regardless of exact meaning, the status of zar is one that is not complimentary and reflects the stranger as potential troublemaker. The third term used to describe the stranger is nekar and its derivative nokri. This term is used for the stranger as true outsider. These individuals, while living among the Israelites, may have had their own gods and their own worship practices. As such, like the zar, only more so, the nekar or the nokri stranger was a threat to Israel's righteousness, as it was the nekar or the nokri who worshipped strange gods. In similar fashion, the strange woman in Proverbs symbolized the temptations that pulled Israel away from their God. While throughout Ezekiel and Jeremiah, the metaphor of Israel as a harlot among foreigners is used to denote Israel's apostasy. Legally, Israel was to limit their interaction with the Nekar. Above and beyond the restrictions placed upon the czar, according to Leviticus 22:25, Israel was not to buy livestock or any other items used for sacrifice from this type of stranger. While Israel was not allowed to charge loan interest to another Israelite, they could charge interest for loans to the Nekar. The same applies for loan forgiveness during the Jubilee. While Israel was to forget the loans of other Israelites, of a foreigner thou mayest exact. Yet for all this, the Nokri was still a part of Israel's community and had been from the beginning. In Deuteronomy 29, the Ben Nokri who appear to work as manual labor within the camp are included among those who were to enter the promised land. And as such, it would appear that at least some Nokri saw value in being part of the greater Israelite community. Significantly, it is the Nekar who is referenced in Isaiah 56, proclaiming their concern about not being a part of God's people. The three aspects of strangeness demonstrate the complicated and ambivalent nature of the relationship between the stranger and Israel. On the one hand, the stranger as Ger could participate to a large degree with their neighbors, both socially and religiously. The stranger as Czar, though, reflected the implicit wrongness and potential threat that a stranger or foreigner represented, while the stranger as Nokri realized the unique peril that Israel succumbed to again and again, that being the forsaking of God and following after other gods. As such, their presence, the stranger's presence, was to be tolerated, but interaction minimalized. Moreover, as the regulations concerning the Passover demonstrate, though the stranger as Ger may participate in that most familial of feasts, at least according to Exodus 12, they are the exception, as it is generally understood that the stranger, noted as Ben Nekar, was not to do so. Thus it appears that when confronted with a stranger, one began with the assumption that they were Nokri, not Ger. Moreover, while it appears that all strangers were Ger when requiring legal aid and welfare, equal to other marginalized members of the community, when lending money or eating the carcass of an animal that died of natural causes, the stranger, whether Ger or Nokri, was clearly understood as different. For all Israel's empathy to the plight of the stranger was always a threat to the well-being of Israel, whether as Nokri and their dangerous native lifestyle, or as Ger, who could rise up against you. Thus the stranger belonged and did not belong. Treated well by the Israelite neighbors, but reminded in many ways that they were not Israelite and that they did not belong. It is this tension, this uncertainty as to their place in the world, that resonates from the stranger's cry in Isaiah 56. The Lord hath utterly separated me from his people. The second individual crying to God in Isaiah 56 is the eunuch. Like the stranger, the eunuch represents a marginalized segment of society seeking solace in the Lord. Eunuchs played intriguing roles in the ancient world. They were often associated with the ruling class, performing vital, important roles as advisors and guardians. Yet, eunuchs held these positions of trust precisely because of their defect. As such, it was believed that they did not represent a threat to the ruler in question. Thus, like the stranger, the eunuch was an ambiguous, marginalized individual. As for the cause of the marginalization, physical defects or disabilities impeded one from normal social interaction. There is much less instruction concerning Israel and the disabled or defective than there is concerning Israel and the stranger. Nevertheless, what is found is instructive. Of course, there is instruction concerning the care of the disabled. Leviticus 19, verse 14, for instance, warns Israel not to curse the deaf nor put a stumbling block before the blind. Similarly, in Deuteronomy 27, verse 18, cursed be he that make the blind to wander out of the way. Moreover, the instruction in Leviticus 13 and 14 concerning the condition of those stricken with visible skin ailments may be understood as beneficial, as the intended purpose is to rid the individual of the ailment. Yet this very instruction highlighted the separation between the defective and the greater Israel, as central to the instruction was the quarantine and isolation of the afflicted. Other texts speak to the social marginalization of the disabled. On an aesthetic level, two of the primary qualities of beauty was physical symmetry and a lack of defects, beauty itself being associated with social and divine approval. Thus, the individual who was disabled or defective not only suffered from being ugly, but also from the stigma of perceived divine disapproval. Economically, while such individuals could care for themselves depending on the type of the disability, often they were limited and thus reliant on the welfare of others, as noted in the instruction above. While these highlight some of the social challenges the disabled or defective would have experienced, it is particularly in their interaction with the temple and the priests that demonstrate the marginalization of the disabled. Among the instruction in Leviticus 22, Israel was told that there should be no blemish or defect in any of the animals offered for sacrifice. Quote, "It shall be perfect to be accepted. There shall be no blemish therein, blind or broken, or maimed, or having a wen, or scurvy, or scabbed. Ye shall not offer these to the Lord." The principle behind this instruction appears to reflect the understanding that the divine realm was one of completeness and wholeness. Thus, that which was offered to the Lord was expected to be in the best quality in terms of beauty. In similar fashion, one chapter earlier, Leviticus 21 described the qualities of the priest who could serve in the temple. "Whosoever he be of thy," Aaron's, "seed in their generations, that hath any blemish, let him not approach to offer the bread of his God. For whatsoever man he be that hath a blemish, he shall not approach, a blind man or a lame, or that had a flat nose, or anything deformed, or a man that is broken-footed, or broken-handed, or a crooked back, or a dwarf, or that hath a defect in the eye, or be scurvy, or scabbed, or has his stones broken. No man that hath a blemish of the seed of Aaron, the priest, shall come nigh to offer the offerings of the Lord." Like the animal to be offered, the priest was to represent the ideal of the physical form when functioning in the temple. Any disability disqualified such an individual. Verse 23 further restricts some individuals, declaring that they cannot come nigh to the veil or the altar lest they profane the sanctuary. The threat of profane contagion that results from their presence suggests an even more isolating element to the disabled and defective, as their very presence were sources of profaneness, and therefore an impediment to the continual attempts by Israel to be holy. Yet the disabled priest was still a priest, and therefore could partake of food designated for the priest. Again, as with the stranger, the limited privileges actually accentuate the disparity, as the disabled or the defective priest could participate in some ways, particularly in those ways in which he received aid, while being restricted from performing the sacred priestly duties, or in other words, providing spiritual aid for others. He could stand in the company of the priesthood, but he couldn't stand in the sanctuary. While the above reflects the limitations to the disabled priest, it would appear they held to Israelite disabled generally. 2 Samuel 5 verse 8 declares that the lame and the blind were not allowed to enter the sanctuary. No reason is given, but it is likely the reason is the same as that of the disabled priest. Even more limiting is the injunction found in Deuteronomy 23 verses 1 and 2, in which the male Israelite who lacks the male sex organs shall not enter the congregation of the Lord. Again, no reason is given. But in this case, not only is the individual disabled and defective physically, the specific loss endangers the individual's ability to have children. While much has been written about the role of childbearing in the social identity of Israelite women, it appears that as much social stigma surrounded the Israelite man who could not produce children. Indeed, it is possible that one of the primary ideals of Israelite manliness was his virility. Thus, the male who lacks the reproductive organs is not only physically disabled, but socially as well, unable to experience the covenant blessings accorded to Israel. As with the stranger's cry, the eunuch's cry in Isaiah 56, "Behold, I am a dry tree," reflects the voice of a marginalized group who, like the stranger, was both part and not part of the Israelite community. Both groups were accorded legal rights and were expected to be treated humanely by their neighbors. Both could participate in the community's events. Yet both groups were also limited in what they could do. Their participation, while reflected in Israel's responsibilities, highlighted their separation from the larger community. And while Israel is severely condemned both in the law and in the prophets for mistreatment of the marginalized, the limitations would have impacted the marginalized and their sense of belonging, even if persecution was not experienced. And it is that voice that we find expressed in Isaiah 56. Considered to be a part of 3rd Isaiah, chapter 56 may be placed in a larger context of promises and prophecies concerning Israel's restoration. These follow Isaiah's earlier messages of judgment, which Israel was to suffer for forsaking God. Having experienced God's judgment, Israel was now promised a return, a restoration, even a transformation back to the close relationship with God. In light of this overarching theme, the pleas of Isaiah 56 are striking, as they represent groups that appear to have felt left behind or unable to experience the promised blessings. Unlike the precepts of the law, which outline Israel's relationship to the marginalized, emphasizing the particular challenges and responsibilities of such, Isaiah 56 provides the voice of those self-same marginalized and God's response to those pleas. The selection of the stranger and the eunuch to represent the marginalized may not be coincidental, as both share certain unique characteristics. As noted earlier, both the stranger and the eunuch of Isaiah 56 are familiar with God and his works. As part of the larger community, it appears that each has watched God's interaction with Israel and desired to have their own relationship. The stranger, for instance, is described as one who, quote, hath joined himself to the Lord, unquote. Moreover, the Lord's response is for those eunuchs who, quote, keep my Sabbaths and choose the things that please me and take hold of my covenant, unquote. Yet for all their desire, as outlined above, full participation has been denied these individuals. Metaphorically, the stranger and the eunuch can look through the window, recognize the feast spread out on the table, even celebrating with the household the gathering of the bounty, but are not allowed to enter and partake. This unique perspective, made possible through partial interaction, makes the exclusion even more painful. Also significant in the selection of the stranger and the eunuch is that they appear to represent marginalization at both ends of the social spectrum. Again, as noted above, the stranger was often paralleled with the poor and other economically challenged groups, while the eunuch was often found in the upper echelons of social society. Thus, the stranger and eunuch were unique voices that could represent all who felt marginalized within the greater Israelite community. As one would expect, the individual pleas reflect the distinctive fears of the particular marginalized. The voice of the stranger, for instance, cries out that the Lord hath utterly separated me from his people. Having always been at least partially isolated from the Israelites, the stranger now fears that with the fulfillment of the promises and the glorious restoration of Israel, that this partial isolation will now be a complete separation. One can recognize the sense of abandonment and loneliness that the marginalized may feel. Similarly, the eunuch's exclamation, "Behold, I am a dry tree," reflects the eunuch's anxiety that there is no place for them, no posterity who can enjoy the promised blessings. Highlighted in both pleas is the horrific awareness of both knowing what they are missing out on and their powerlessness to do anything about it. This makes the Lord's answers to both all the more poignant as they specifically address these fears. Speaking to the eunuch first, the Lord promises, "Even unto them will I give in mine house and within my walls a place and a name, better than of sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off." As noted earlier, the eunuch, by virtue of his disability, was not allowed to participate fully in Israel's worship at the temple. For Israel, the temple was more than merely a place of worship. It represented a sense of permanence, of place, of belonging. Thus, God's promise meant that the disabled had a place, and that place was not just at the temple, but within the walls in the house itself. This promise of place was paralleled by the promise of placement within the family. The new name or designation is not provided, but the claim that it was even better than son or daughter indicates that it would demonstrate the true inclusion of the eunuch into the household of God. It may even allude to a future in which the eunuch could bear fruit, i.e., sons and daughters, just as the promises were made to normative Israel. Thus, to the marginalized eunuch who believed that the covenant blessings had no application to them, the Lord promised an eternal identity and belonging equal to that of his chosen people. In similar fashion, the promises to the stranger respond directly to their fears by reconciling their inability to attend the temple. "Even them will I bring to my holy mountain, and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices shall be accepted upon mine altar. For mine house shall be called a house of prayer for all people." One of the primary restrictions of the stranger, as noted in the law, is their participation at the temple. Thus, the promise of the Lord is that they would be able to have the same temple experience as that of Israel. It is there that they were to experience joy, as their offerings are accepted by God. Importantly, the text suggests that it would be God himself who brings the stranger into the temple. The particular verbal form of "to bring" is one often associated with the bringing of offerings into the temple, and is commonly used to describe what mankind brings to the temple. In this case, the stranger is not only brought by God, but may in fact be his sacrifice, his offering, which is a status associated in the law with the priest or the firstborn. Thus, the stranger's total reversal from outsider to priest. Finally, it is through the stranger that the true significance of the temple is revealed, as it is to be understood as a house of prayer for all. In this, then, the stranger finds a necessary, vital identity in the plan of God. In Isaiah's prophetic message of comfort, one can note a manner by which the law and the prophets engaged one another. Whereas the law's primary focus is on Israel's responsibility not only to the marginalized, but also to their own spiritual integrity, the prophets allow for the marginalized voices to be expressed. Importantly, neither perspective is wrong, yet the true picture is incomplete without the other. Like two sides of the same coin, the perspective of the law and the perspective of the prophets together reveal the true extent of God's work to all mankind through the medium of his chosen people Israel. Not surprisingly, the binding elements to these perspectives, That which makes the two texts complementary is the temple. While the temple, or tabernacle, played a vital, easily discernible role in the formation of Israel's identity, in the three law codes, and throughout their recorded history for that matter, it is striking how much the temple also plays a role in Isaiah 56, in alleviating the fears of those who are marginalized. For both the stranger and the eunuch, their lack of identity and sense of belonging, which had led to a sense of futility and abandonment, it was to be in the temple that their relationship with God would be realized. It was in the Lord's house that the eunuch would receive a better name than son and daughter. It was in the holy mountain that the stranger would be brought and made joyful. Perhaps as significant as the new identity was the understanding that this identity was appreciated and even valued by God himself. For Israel, the temple was the place where this value was reaffirmed each time they performed the sacrifices and offerings. For the marginalized who could not participate to the same degree, the prophetic promise was God would give them an everlasting name, the emphasis being that God himself would be the one doing so. Similarly, it was the Lord who would bring the stranger in and make them joyful. Thus, the temple was not only the place by which identity was received, but it was also the place where a personal, individual relationship could be experienced. The harmony of the law and the prophets via the temple can be understood as more than an academic exercise. For the two perspectives often reflect challenges that we in this modern era also struggle with. Feelings of being isolated, alone, abandoned, of not belonging. The experience of the marginalized. These are all real experiences that still exist. Israel's responsibility to be empathetic to the plight of the stranger, as outlined in the law, while not losing one's own relationship with God in the larger world, is as valid today as it was in Moses' day. And the Lord's responses to the stranger and disabled continue to provide solace and respite for those who feel like they do not fit the correct model. The need for identity and true belonging is still central to our well-being. And the centrality of the temple in the formation of these is as true today as it was back then. The power of the law is fully exercised only through the divine compassion revealed by the words of the prophet. And the combination of the two in the temple experience, a revelation given to us through the prophet Isaiah, becomes a means by which we can understand the human experience. And more importantly, the manner by which God reveals his supernal understanding of who we really are. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.